what's your little problem got to do with His Majesty's Royal Air Corps?
Not a damn thing.
Is it dangerous?
Well, you probably won't live through it.
Why, Joe? Do you really think so?
Well, everybody else we bumped into has died. Why not you?
What's the challenge then?
Rescue the damsel in distress, kill the bad guy, and save the world.
Oh, Winston Havelock, at your service, sir.
Hey Exiles, Chronic Painless here with the 30-day Crucible League update to my Blade Vortex League starter build guide. In this video, I want to go over my most recent project and why it motivated me to make the unprecedented move of speccing back to an Elementalist. So, let's get right to it. The goal for my last couple of weeks has been building the most comfortable, high DPS, feared farmer that I possibly could on top of my Gold BV build, of course. And it has been a tremendous success. And there are several keys to this that I want to highlight. And the first of which is how I became tanky enough to where I felt really comfortable, never having to worry about losing my portals, not having to do Matha level dodging, and just being able to casually and easily complete even the Maven Witnessed Uber Elder and Uber Cortex. So there were 5 things that I focused on to achieve my desired level of tankiness. Those were cold resistance, spell suppression, armor with additional fizz reduction, ailment avoidance, and of course a little bit of regen. I chose to focus on cold resistance because I knew that the toughest fight by far would be the Uber Elder, especially with the Maven Witness. And the thing about this fight is that almost all of their big scary damage is cold. The exception to this is the Shaper Beam, but with Leaf Shade, we give ourselves plenty of time to flame dash out of the way should we wind up face tanking it for a second. So to bump up my cold res, the first thing I did was try to add a Purity of Ice aura. This was enabled by getting a 90% reservation multiplier corruption on my Heat Shiver. It was definitely worth doing this despite having to give up the power charge corruption, because although a little bit of extra damage would have been nice, this mana reservation enabled me to not only run Purity of Ice, but also a max level vitality that made me feel a lot comfier in these highly dangerous fights. I also crafted a max res implicit on my armor. I chose to go for the 3 to all res because I felt that while cold was the most important, I didn't want to completely neglect fire and lightning as well. Naturally, I finished this off by putting a sapphire flask on my Mageblood setup in order to take even less cold damage. And with all those things combined, the Maven Witnessed Uber Elder felt really comfy, even with my well-documented potato skills. To incorporate spell suppression, I knew that I didn't want to give up the Heat Shiver, so that meant focusing on gloves, chest, and boots to get as much as I could. I also got a Corrupt Implicit on my Quiver, added a Quartz Flask to my Mageblood setup, and finally got the last few percentage points that I needed from the passive tree. Armor came largely, of course, from the Determination, Defiance Banner, and Granite Flask combo, but I also made sure to add 2 physical clusters to the build for the very potent Battle-Hardened Notable. But of course, just having armor isn't enough, so I also sought out substantial sources of additional physical damage reduction, getting a pair of Circle of Guilts, as well as a Watcher's Eye with the Determination Explicit. For ailment avoidance, even though this is something I've normally ignored in other versions of the build, I knew that I didn't want to rely on the Brine King Pantheon because the Arakali Pantheon is so important for mitigating the substantial amount of damage over time that comes out from these feared bosses. Instead, I went for an implicit on my chest, boots, and an implicit on my boots as well, and with all of these very highly rolled, I was able to get myself to 100% ailment avoidance at all times. The last important piece, as I was just alluding to, is damage over time mitigation. The feared do all kinds of damage over time, be it the Shaper's Beams, the Maven's cold pools, the Uber Cortex's physical pools, right? No matter where you go, you're going to be taking some damage over time, so it's really important to mitigate that as much as possible. That's where the Pantheons come in, that's where Leaf Shade comes in, and that's where having a little bit of regen comes in. And so I made sure I had enough mana reservation to where I could run a full vitality on top of my life leech, and this made me feel very comfy even when I was taking some damage and not even necessarily noticing that I was standing on a ground degen. That's enough talk about tankiness. Let's talk about damage. The key to the damage in this loadout, of course, was the Heat Shiver. Heat Shiver provides a tremendous amount of damage against single targets, and it is very easy to utilize it well with the cold BV build. Now, as strong as Heat Shiver is, there are a few key factors to keep in mind when trying to get the most out of it. The biggest of these is the difference between damage and damage taken. When you are hitting a monster, you are providing a certain amount of damage, but then the monster has its resistances manipulated by either exposure, pen, or shock, anything of that nature, and that will increase the amount of damage that is actually dealt to the monster. And for Heat Shiver, the cold damage that we gain as extra fire damage is only going to be based on the cold damage we are outputting. Therefore, anything that was only manipulating the amount of cold damage that my enemies were taking became half as effective as it would have been in a build that wasn't trying to maximize Heat Shiver. This was the primary motivation for my swap from Occultist back to Elementalist. The Occultist has two important tendencies that really became substantially less potent with the Heat Shiver involved. And these were the Unholy Authority and the Void Beacon. Unholy Authority was giving me the option of doing a third curse, but Frostbite suddenly was at 50% less effectiveness compared to Elemental Weakness. This meant that I only needed 2 curses, with the Assassin's Mark being layered on top. Void Beacon gives a penalty to cold resistance, which does not affect my fire damage at all. Frigid Wake and Forbidden Power are still just as strong as they were before, but with 2 of the Ascendancies suddenly being cut in half, it seemed like it was time to go back to the Elementalist. When we look at the Elementalist Ascendancies, we can see how all of the damage manipulations are being applied broadly. When we are using Shaper of Storms, we're applying a big shock, and that shock is increasing both cold and fire damage taken. When we use the Mastermind of Discord to increase our exposure, and are using Heraldry with Herald of Ice and Herald of Ash, that's applying to both fire and cold damage. And of course, the Heart of Destruction is simply a more damage multiplier that's going to boost our damage no matter what we're doing. Finally, Bastion of Elements also became really attractive because it would give me a huge extra guard, but also make me immune to Elemental Reflection, which was crucial for doing Uber at Ziri without having to mess around with my Pantheon and passive tree. Another example of a change that I made in order to better enable Heat Shiver was moving the Heart of Ice out of the tree and instead getting the Breath of Rime. The only reason to focus on just increasing the cold damage that monsters are taking would be to ensure that they are getting frozen. And so Heart of Ice, with its penetration, is nowhere near as effective as Breath of Rime with its increased freeze duration. As we know, increased freeze duration is essentially freeze as though dealing more damage. So 50% more freeze power is a lot better than 6% pen. And it saved a passive point. And as I mentioned in my last video, using Scorch is incredibly powerful with Heat Shiver since it creates a positive feedback loop that gets you to extreme levels of resistance penalty. Another way that I sought to increase my damage was adding Zealotry via a Divine Blessing setup. Now I was able to do this because of the Mageblood giving me the ability to lower the mana cost of that Divine Blessing down to 0. With Divergent Inspiration support, the Dreamer notable, and the Suffix craft on my flask in a Mageblood setup, I was able to reduce the mana cost of this down to 0%. Of course, I didn't want to reduce my Blade Vortex's cost all the way down to 0%, but that's where just simply not having a Divergent Inspiration was all that I needed. The final and probably the most important way that I increased my damage was by crafting the People's Spellbow. This bow is my attempt at making the absolute highest DPS possible spellbow that I could with the Crucible mechanic. While I know there is a Mirror Service BV bow already out there, that one is certainly more mapping focused with the Rampage as well as the Explosion implicit. I instead went for pure damage implicits and chose to get pure damage on the Crucible tree as well. I also just want to say that I think the aspect of the spider mod on that bow is kind of a bait, especially if you're running inspiration support, because inspiration will actually make the aspect of the spider cost even more mana to reserve, and it's already a pretty inefficient source of damage for mana reservation trade-off, especially with all of the other increased damage taken that I'm able to give to these monsters. And when you consider the fact that most things aren't going to live long enough to get 3 webs on them, then it just seems like a complete waste. And that's pretty much it. With all these factors combined, I more than accomplished my goal of feeling incredibly comfy, farming even 8 mod feared invitations, and doing the Maven witnessed Uber Elder without ever fearing losing my portals. The profits have been very boom or bust, but pretty good overall, and I'm probably going to keep going with this strat until I either drop a mirror or the league ends. Now, I know there's one question a lot of you probably have. Can this be done without Mageblood? And the answer is probably not, unless you're willing to do a lot of gaming. With enkindling orbs applied to them, granite flask, sapphire flask, and quartz flask will provide so much tankiness that you would have to trade off an incredible amount of DPS in order to make up for it, to the point where I don't think it would feel very comfortable with reliably freezing the monsters in order to enable that heat shiver damage. Of course, if you're willing to just forego those defenses and do a lot of dodging around, it's entirely possible to trivialize almost all of these fights with DPS, with the obvious exception of the Uber Elder, who is going to get his minion portal phases no matter how much damage you're dealing. I think you could definitely reach a very similar level of DPS on a much lower budget, but you would have to have less than capped spell suppression, making use of the lucky spell suppression mastery. You would have to have substantially less armor because of the lack of the boosted granite flask, and you would have to have a very unreliable sapphire flask that hopefully you are good at pushing at the right time when you're about to take that big burst of cold damage. That's all I've got for this video. I might have another update before Crucible League ends, but if I don't, try to stay painless.
I absolutely love.